following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for going good crazy. This episode, we're doing a flip to last week's. Last week was an issue that affects everyone but has a unique impact on women. This week, we're going to focus on an issue that affects everyone but has a unique impact on men. See, we're doing it all balanced, right? Specifically, male friendships. There is this trope out there of a guy who is really successful and brings his entourage of friends along for the ride. And I use the word entourage pointedly because the show by that name is pretty much dead center of this trope. Because the friends tend to be a bunch of allegedly lovable losers who are interesting and relatable, mainly because of the problems they cause for the main character, often involving drugs and various other possibly unhealthy things, right? Jealousy, unhealthy competitiveness, a feeling among some in the entourage that they need to be as successful as the main character. These things tend to drive the plots of these stories, as well as side plots of characters whose associates with and money from the main character fuel many of their bad habits. I am not sure how many sentences I just accomplished there. That very stream of consciousness that was. Oh boy. The series, these sorts of series that follow this male friend group trope, often ends with one of them, usually the main character, getting married. And this brings the toxic masculinity hijinks TM to an end. And I don't like the term toxic masculinity, but in this case, it's almost cynically calibrated to be included in these shows. And this is the difference that I see society pointing to. Now, I'm not claiming that media creates these things. No. It's just reflecting something that may not be measurable, but the expectation is very real. There's a lot of tea spilt about how toxic shows for women are, you know, Emily in Paris, Sex in the City, those hot take fuel shows. But there's an unease doing similar with these bro shows, right? And I'm only bringing this up because it's a thing a lot of people have seen, but I've observed it in groups of men in real life. Guys put up with a lot of bad behavior, including bigoted comments, flat out law breaking from their friends. And they don't agree with this behavior. They don't agree with these attitudes. They don't share them, but they don't want to ruin anyone's good time. Meanwhile, these guys are not having a good time because these friendships are not reciprocal. Like I did in last week's episode, I'm going to do the "this happens to women too" caveat right now. But this is where we get into the data. Something unique is going on with men. We know men's friendships and lack thereof have unique problems. We know men have fewer friends than women, especially close friends, and this gap gets worse throughout their lives. Now, we also know that men are more involved in their children's lives than ever. Men are being better dads than at any point in history, and men are now more likely to go to their parents when they need advice on a problem than women. That's the good news. And this comes from data from the Survey Center for American Life, who this center really monitors the loneliness epidemic. But according to the same new data, Black men without college degrees are suffering most from the lack of social integration, lack of friendships, from loneliness. Black men without college degrees and without union jobs who don't go to church specifically, but that's off topic, back on topic. It's worse for unmarried men as well. And this is a kind of flashing warning sign because Gen Z up here in Canada, 44% of Gen Z men report zero dating experience in high school. Zero dating experience in high school. This is a study inclusive of LGBTQ plus men. So it isn't just straight dudes. 44%, almost half, no dating experience in high school. And obviously this is where our social habits for life get set, right? And so what are the experts blaming with all this money and all these resources? What are they blaming? Video games and smartphones. And that's wrong. We're here again. The experts have tried to blame video games for every social ill affecting youth since the 1990s, possibly even earlier, though in the late 80s, it was Dungeons and Dragons. Then they spend millions on studies to discover it wasn't the video games. And ironically, my guest this week for the interview is a game developer, a tabletop game developer. James Grimm Desborough of Postmortem Studios will be here to talk to me after the break to give a male point of view, a man's point of view on the subject of male friendships. Because it would be super awkward if it was just me this whole time, right? But getting back to video games. There's no better way to alienate yourself from a group you're trying to reach than to demonize the stuff they like. My peer counseling business is overwhelmingly male. Most of them are gamers. Based on what they say, video games fill the voids in their life. They don't create the problems. Of course, then you get other experts from the other side of the political divide, and they blame the Me Too movement. And well, okay, the reaction of the Me Too movement explains why men aren't dating, right? If you don't approach women, you can't get accused of bad behavior. It doesn't explain the noticeable positive impact that marriage has on a men's friend count. So if the divergent number of friends, especially later in life, where because of Me Too, we'd see married men being affected just the same as, other types of men, right? Right. Some people say, no, that's not true. Hear me out. It's a chicken and the egg problem. Here's how it works. More friends means you're more likely to date. That makes sense, right? More people, more opportunities to be introduced to someone, a greater sample size, so to speak. Then dating obviously means you're more likely to marry. Marriage means you're more likely to have friends later in life. So more friends predates more dating, but dating and marriage means more friends. If the problem was just Me Too, men's friendships wouldn't be tied to their spouse, which is more often than not a woman, and that spouse wouldn't be more likely to come from the friends that some of these men don't have. Follow? Follow. The lack of reciprocity in friendships is a core problem among my client base. The theory goes like this. There's no point in having friends when friendships cost you time, money, and pain and don't give you much in return. And yes, I hear this from women too. But we're focusing on men because of the loneliness epidemic among men. I also noticed something else. There's a lot of talk about what it means to be bad friends in women's circles. A bunch of friends and I had a debate that stretched weeks about whether this character named Lucian in A Court of Thorn and Roses was a bad friend to the main character, Feyre. And these were fictional characters in romance fantasy. But it's not just about the romance fantasy. We're focusing on the values that are important to us. We're communicating our expectations for friendships. Anecdotally, I find that women are focused on whether someone else is being a bad friend. There's sort of this policing social groups through judgments, right? Men, on the other hand, spend a lot more focus on avoiding being the bad friend. So it's internal instead of external. The thing is, an unbalanced focus on either of these elements risks you being the actual bad friend. Hear me out, because this was something I had to learn myself. Mea culpa, right here. My whole life, I have feared being a burden. So I didn't accept help and support. I wouldn't reach out to people to say, hey, how you doing? Because I'm terrified of annoying people. And they also didn't want to bother me because I'm always so busy. Yes, that's true. So we were doing the same thing to each other, and we just weren't talking. I still have issues promoting my own stuff, like this show, because I really don't like talking about myself. I'm an introvert. This takes work, speaking about myself, but there's some childhood damage as well, right? I got called selfish and ungrateful a lot as a kid. And I think this might be something that is why I understand the male experience, because men are taught, be the man of the house, need nothing, need no one, be strong, right? Here's the flip side of this that I had to learn. And I'm not speaking for men, I'm only speaking for myself. That's why Grimm's on later. If you don't state your needs and wants, then people don't know what you need and want. And it's better to do that, state your needs and wants, before you're angry and bitter and emotionally dysregulated because those needs aren't met. And these conversations about fictional characters that women have, bad friend, not bad friend. Thanks, Lucian, taking it on the chin as usual in that book series, right? Sarah J. Maas for the win. Yay. Women have these conversations. Men don't. And this contributes to a reduced lack of emotional vocabulary in men and loneliness, even you were surrounded by people. Again, this is what I had to learn. Being responsible for your own emotional needs does not mean protecting the world from your emotional needs. Top 10 phrase, don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. And I want to get into that. We may not get into time because this is me talking about men's perspective. I don't want to do that. Let's get to my guest, returning It's Not Therapy interview, James Grimm, Desborough of Postmortem Studios, a really cool tabletop game company out of the UK, that's England. Up next to talk about reciprocation in friendships on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we're still talking reciprocity in friendships. And as promised, yes, this show has a male focus, so I promised you guys a guest who is a man, again, counteracting last week's very women-focused. And it was just an excuse to have somebody I like very much back on the show. James Grimm Desborough, head of Postmortem Studios. It's a tabletop game company out of the UK, post-mort.com. James, welcome back to It's Not Therapy. Good to have you.
Happy to be back.
We, by complete serendipity, were talking about this last week, which is why I decided to have you on. And reciprocity is this funny concept, right? Because it's not A equals B like equality. It's more of an equivalency thing, right? It's mutual benefit as opposed to just, I loan you some money, you pay me back. So how do you define reciprocity in friendships?
To me, it's more like a sort of unspoken social contract, right? It's not as formal as, I lend you money, you pay me back money with 10% interest
Right.
or whatever it might be. It's just these kind of unspoken expectations that we have of each other. And you usually only really become aware of them when it gets violated. So when you get let down.
Yeah, now before the break, I was talking about the ways certain gendered leanings happen here that women, if you watch any content or you listen to groups of women's talk, there's this obsession almost with people being bad friends. With men, I find it's more, and this is why I wanted to have you on to confirm or correct this. There's more a concern about not being that guy who takes instead of gives. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, and I think guys are very reluctant to label each other. So it will take a long time for someone to be cast out or to get any pushback. There's always that one guy who's always mooching, never
Mhm.
chips in for the pizza, whatever it is. But it takes a very long time for resentment to build up, and there might well be other ways in which he holds up his end. So it's it's more of a feeling. It's an art, not science.
Yeah, and that's what makes it difficult. And there is that thing that we know about men's socialization in particular that they tend to be around common activities. So nobody wants to quote unquote ruin everybody's good time, even if you yourself are not having a good time. Would you say that's accurate as well?
Yeah. You don't want to mess things up for everybody. If you've had a falling out with one person, then one or the other of you is probably just not going to turn up. Or if you do, you're going to keep it quiet, keep it to yourself, because you
Yeah.
don't want to mess things up. Even if you're staring daggers at each other across the room or
Yeah.
whatever, don't rock the boat.
Yeah, it's very, very different. And I think it's less about inherent differences in men and women as opposed to what people can get away with or what's seen as socially acceptable. But of course, if you're not showing up at events because you don't want there to be an issue, you're not showing up at events, you're not getting that socialization. And it just becomes a spiral very, very quickly. And we know that as life goes on, men have fewer friends than women. So this is something we have to adjust for everybody's benefit. And I've sort of isolated this idea of emotional reciprocity versus tangible reciprocity. And you touched on that with your comments about a guy sort of being a mooch, but he gives back or pulls his weight in other ways. Can you unpack that more for us?
It could be emotional support. Could be the guy you lean on, or it might be the guy that will always turn up to help you move stuff, or will drive. Will be the designated driver,
Mhm.
or whatever else. So it's kind of like a non unspoken barter system almost, but without anyone keeping tabs. Like I said, you just kind of know when it's off somehow.
Now, what
Um,
what are some signs that it's off?
Someone starts to be resented. I don't think men gossip quite so much.
Hmm.
There's a lot of non-verbal stuff. So, shared looks when they do whatever it is again. Like I don't know, coming on to someone else's girlfriend or
Yikes. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, I can't pay this week. Yeah, you couldn't pay last week either.
Yeah. Yeah. That seems to be the one that gets called out as much of, and it's not, hey, you better pay this time. It's like, oh, that guy, he never pays for anything. There's quite a few people in the Canadian entertainment industry that have that well-earned reputation. Yeah, and you've been doing the tabletop gaming with Postmortem Studios for quite a while. So obviously it's difficult to do a one-to-one reciprocation with somebody who's established like yourself. But for somebody who doesn't have the experience, let's say you mentor, what would you consider reciprocity down the line with someone like that you help out?
I think if you give people opportunities, if you give them work when they need it because they need it, I quite like to do that. I like to seek out people who can't make rent this month or
Hmm.
something else, and I like to kind of come in and help them out, but without necessarily being charitable because I'm giving them work. But then you hope that, if they're successful at some point in the future, they might recommend you to other people who are doing projects, or they might send other people your way, or if they find someone talented, a writer or an artist or whatever else, they might suggest that they get in touch with you, or if you develop separate audiences, they might share your material with their
Hmm.
audience and vice versa. So, I mean, it's still very much a hobby industry once you drop below the sort of middle tier. So a lot relies on word of mouth, networks of friendships, trade in favors and so on. So a lot of it runs on this kind of reciprocity.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You say sort of you recognize it may not be capable of happening because there's a lot of luck in anything creative, but down the road if somebody can, put in a good word, that's helpful. You touched on something else that I think is very important about kind of the idea of pride. If you make a big deal about helping someone out, I find they won't take it because it's shameful. I read in some psychological profiles on this phenomenon, the thinking is I'll never be able to repay this, so I'm not going to accept the kindness. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I certainly squirm when I'm offered help on those sorts of terms. That may just be Britishness. I don't know,
Well,
but
these were American studies, so I
oh well,
thought we could balance it out. There we go. Some things are universal. Yeah.
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 So, but yeah, I definitely squirm, and I do think it's easier for people if you dress up your assistants in other ways, other terms, so that they don't necessarily feel like they're being given a charitable handout.
Now, why is the idea of a handout such a deal breaker in these? Because everybody knows it's true, but putting into words why I think is usually helpful.
I think it suggests. I think it undermines your confidence to a
Hmm.
degree because it
Okay.
suggests that you're not capable of success or of completing a project or whatever it is, or learning by yourself, and so there's somehow some sort of personal failing involved. It might be limited to kind of Anglo cultures, that kind of Protestant work ethic shame thing. It might be less prevalent in other cultures, perhaps, but that's certainly how I interpret it.
I mean, Asian face culture is pretty notorious, so I think at least there we can say no, it's there too. But
Hmm.
you've really nailed the real challenge of this whole reciprocity thing when you described it as an unspoken social contract. Social contract, variable one that can be quite dicey, right? Because this idea that just being within the society or subculture, if you will, you have agreed to certain things simply by existing. And then the fact that it's unspoken,
Hmm.
obviously, these things trip probably with alarming regularity. There's all these stories from therapists of people getting really dug in, especially older people who are
Hmm.
lonely, but they won't call their friends because they're standing on ceremony. I don't know if you have older relatives that are doing this. Mine did this before they passed away of, oh, it's her turn to call. Well, why does that matter? Well, because it just becomes the principle of the thing and that overrides the loneliness. And that maybe that is a cultural thing as well, but there is a thing, especially within the generations, that there's expectation of calling and then
Yeah.
just nobody calls.
Yeah.
So what's a way that you can think of to kind of overcome that, to thread the needle so it's not giving charity or worse, calling somebody, with clear resentment, with, oh, I have to do this, doing it with a glad heart, so to speak, but also not making it seem like you're doing someone a favor.
Yeah, I think if you come at it like you've got some other reason. So to
Okay.
take your example of calling a relative or whatever, it was their turn, but they haven't called you, and you need a reason to get back in touch because you want them to call you. So why not call them? But come up with some other reason, some event, or do you remember where we put the so and so when we cleared grandma's house? So
Okay.
that sort of thing. Come up with a reason, a pretext. And even though you know it's pretend, I
Mhm.
think it makes it easier for you to do it, and it makes it easier for them to accept that you're calling.
Yeah, it's funny how often the fundamental attribution error happens in this, right? Not because of some circumstance like they're depressed or they're embarrassed. It's they just won't. They're being lazy that comes into all of this. It's interesting because in couples, like romantic couples therapy, there's a lot of focus on wanting to be desired. We don't talk about that a lot with friends, especially groups of male friends. And men, again, don't want to speak for you. This is giving you a chance to confirm or correct here. There's this fear that if they really knew me, they'd hate me, or I have to protect other people from the turmoil inside me, that I find anecdotally impacts men more than women. And everybody wants to be wanted by their friends. They want to be someone's happy to see. And yet it's so awkward to state that emotional need to meet it. How am I doing with that statement right there?
Uh, yeah, I think there's a lot to that.
Mhm.
Um, I'm just trying to think of quite how to come at that. Um, I think it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle with a lot of men
Mhm.
because we don't necessarily get together that often. Even as we get older, families. You put your family first,
Yeah.
or you move to different parts of the country, and it's hard to make new friendships or whatever else. So when you do get together, you don't want there to be any drama or emotion or whatever else. You just want to get together and have a good time with your friends. And so things perhaps that you need to say or you need to express don't go expressed because you don't
Mhm.
want to bring everything down. And then you all part company and there's all this stuff that hasn't been said or done. And then you don't see each other again for ages. And that just reinforces, oh, well, we didn't see each other for a very long time. I don't want to ruin the event or whatever. It is nice to be wanted. I think in some ways I have it easy because I work in
Mhm.
tabletop games. My hobby is tabletop games. So when we get together, we're playing tabletop games. So everyone has a use because you're there to play the game. Someone's there to run the game. Someone's hosting the game. Everyone's got a role, and it
Mhm.
kind of creates this preset social structure that you can just kind of slot into and have a reason.
Mhm. And I think that's why things like tabletop games are so popular among men. That social role is so thorny, but I want to take a break because we're about to seg into the next part of this discussion that I wanted to get to. The idea of reciprocating, having each other's backs, defending each other's character with James Grimm Desborough on It's Not Therapy, head of Postmortem Studios, tabletop gaming company, post-mort.com. When we come back, reciprocity in friendships, having your friends' backs on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We are still talking reciprocity in friendships, specifically male friendships, with all that unspoken stuff that nobody wants to speak about because nobody wants to ruin up people's good times, so it never gets spoken about. I'm here with a man, a particular man whose work I like very much, and I think he's a great dude too. James Grimm, Desborough of Postmortem Studios, a tabletop company out in the UK, post-mort.com. And before the break, James, I talked about, it's weird calling you James. It's Grimm to everybody. It is weird. I'm going to call you Grimm. But we were talking about having each other's backs. And this is something I think really has eroded. I'm Gen X. I believe you're Gen X, aren't you, as well?
Well, I say I am. My wife disagrees. We're kind of on the cusp. So
Okay.
it depends.
You've got a Gen X sentiment. But there was this thing back then that has really eroded in that even if your buddy had some wacky ideas, you knew his character, you knew who he was, you stuck up for him. Now that's the cancel machine. Right? It's this idea of somebody steps in something, you're supposed to call them out instead of going, no, look, he made a mistake, but he's a good person. And this is something I think has really undermined friendships and business relationships in the era of social media because there's a punishment to vouching for someone's character. They make a mistake, and yet we know core values are more important to relationships and common interests, the top 10 phrase in the show, for a reason. And it's eroding. I think that's part of the erosion of friendships. Because let's face it, every time you lose a friendship because of a political divide, it really isn't easy to replace that friendship, especially replacing a friendship of 15 years for one of 15 months. It's not the same. So what are your experiences with this? What are your opinions on this? If you don't want to name names and get into gory details, I totally understand, right?
I will try not to. I'll try to speak in general terms, even if I'm thinking about specific events. I think you pretty much got that right in your introduction. Yeah, Gen X, we tended to stick up for each other. It's like, oh, so and so did this. All right, prove it. Show me. You know, there was that demand before you would just go along with hating someone, and you would go to the wall for your friends. I think I came out of my teens and 20s with a very strong sense of loyalty to people, and I used to feel like I was getting that back by the people around me. But yeah, since about 2010 or so, I'd say that's been eroded. You kind of feel like you're always being watched, and someone's just waiting for you to slip up or say the wrong thing. You know, too much one way, too much the other, and people used to stick up for me, and that's gradually disappeared. I still stick up for people, and I've certainly paid the price for doing that.
Well, I mean, that's why I've stayed in contact with you, because you do stick up for people. And so it's like, he's somebody whose character I can vouch for on this show, because you have displayed very strong moral character and a willingness to argue the unpopular side, which I think is important, but I've seen you get bit for it. And I haven't thought it was fair. So here I am in public saying, I think that wasn't fair. I'm practicing what I preach here. But you're right? I mean, I think back to my friendships when I was growing up. And 1994, I realized was a very weird year. It was like The Crow, Natural Born Killers, Pulp Fiction. These movies had some challenging themes, to say the least, right? I mean, I had a friend who was obsessed with atom bombs. And I mean, now that would be considered this, oh, that's problematic, or he's a toxic person, as opposed to, nah, he's just weird. You know, like, we're all weirdos. We all have something strange about us. That intolerance for eccentricity, like you said, around 2010 when we got into the mantra of the internet never forgets,
Yeah.
everybody is running scared, right?
Yeah.
There is no premium. God, loyalty's become a political catchphrase now, right?
Yeah, and I don't think it's valued actually.
Mm-mm.
Even the people who are preaching loyalty, they want loyalty from other people, but then they will turn around and go after them, seemingly, sort of instantly. It's almost like everyone's a politician. I call it the social media panopticon because everyone is watching each other all
Hmm.
the time. I don't know if you get the British version of Red Dwarf over there, but there was an
Yeah,
episode of that, Better Than Life, I think.
yeah,
You see, inform on your friends and family, fabulous prizes to be won, and that's that's kind of what it feels like.
yeah. All my friends know the "I'm gonna eat you, little fishy" that I do every so often from that show. But yeah, the social media panopticon, I mean, in your line of work, it's even more intense because tabletop has exploded in popularity in the last, I guess, 5, 10 years or so, but it's still a very small town where everybody knows each other's business.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I
Especially that again, once you get below those kind of mid-tier companies, it's all personal relationships, it's all personal reputation, it's all gossip.
But even in the big companies, I hear people say, I don't want to be the, divisive personality that sacrifices the work of a team of, I mean, in tabletop, it's not as big as video games, but in video games, like a team of 50, a team of 100, eh,
Mm,
I don't want to be the guy that ruins it for everybody. And there's a real loss of self in that, and
yeah,
I think that's left a lot of people feeling very lonely and very, dare I say, needy. And I think that's why a lot of people are looking for loyalty in other people when loyalty is something I agree with you, you have to get to give. So let's look at this concept of loyalty and drill down on kind of the fundamentals of it. What is it to you? Why is it important?
again, it's part of that unspoken social contract. Like obviously we call each other friends, right? That comes with certain expectations, and they might be mismatched expectations, but both sides have some sort of expectations. I might expect you to be willing to help me hide a body, and you might be, yeah,
That is not what
expecting.
postmortem studios means.
No, it's not what it is. Yeah, and you might be expecting me to, I don't know, cover your cab fare somewhere if you're short. So we have these different expectations, but we
Right.
do have these expectations, and so we're talking about the social media panopticon. If someone comes after you online, tries to cancel you or misrepresent something you've said, I'm going to be there to fight in your corner, and I expect you to do the same in return. But this whole atmosphere that has been created makes people scared to do that,
It also
because
rewards people who don't do that, right? The best thing you
yeah,
can do in a social media fight is switch sides. Those are the people that get rewarded most, at least in the short term.
yeah, people love a convert story.
Uh, and to me, that is just so, like, trust is reciprocal, and I think it is unstated. And yet, at the same time, when you're having those discussions of values, and I said earlier in the show that my friends and I had an intense conversation that went on for weeks about whether a particular character in A Court of Thorn and Roses, that romantasy series, was a bad friend
Mm,
to the female lead.
mm,
And when you're having these conversations about fictional characters, we're expressing meaning. We're saying what values are important to us. I think people don't take those conversations quite seriously enough. And there's sort of an expectation that you don't follow through on your stated morals. Stating the moral is enough. Actually doing it, well, that's what things start to break down, right?
yeah, it's also performative. It's I hate to use the phrase virtue signaling because it's become such a loaded term, but that is essentially what you're doing, or advertising your supposed value scheme. And yeah, that's very different to actually living it.
That's sort of peak leopards ate our faces kind of thing, right? If everything's about the call out, if everything's about the punishment, then everybody lives in fear of being the next one on the chopping block, as opposed to there being certain stated, I mean, no snitching was a thing when I grew up. That I
Yeah,
don't necessarily think that was completely good. A lot of bad behavior was tolerated, but there's got to be some happy medium of if somebody just wants to stay out of it, I think that we have to allow that because so many friendships have ended because someone was forced to have an
yeah,
opinion on something they didn't know anything about, and a
yeah.
very charged opinion. And if if a friend of yours, a good friend of yours, thought you messed up, how would you want him or her to tell you?
Privately, I would
Hmm.
want them to sort of gently poke at my decision making. Um, but I tend to overthink things anyway, so I don't know
Hmm.
how useful that would be. If I've said or done something, then odds are I've been thinking about it for a very long time, and it's quite a
Hmm.
firm decision. But I would want them to come in friendship, you know, and say, "Hey, did you think about this? I think you're coming across this way. I think maybe you've got this bit wrong." Something like that. People have corrected me in the
Hmm.
past, and when I've genuinely been wrong, I fess up and I go with it. Um,
Hmm.
I think you have to, but yeah, that has a social cost attached to it as well. Changing your mind is
Yeah.
supposed to be a good thing, but it's another thing that's not valued.
Yeah, I do think that assuming good intents is essential to this stuff because if there's an assumption of ill intent or intents don't matter, I think the relationship is already profoundly damaged. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah, I think you have to. I mean, it opens you up to exploitation to a degree, and it puts you in some bad situations, perhaps. But I think, I mean, there's no absolutes. Only Sith deal in absolutes. But
Yep.
you should try to always give people the benefit of the doubt, and you'll be right more often than you're wrong, I think.
Okay, we've had a Star Wars reference, which means this is an officially a good It's Not Therapy interview. A couple weeks ago, we had this psychology guru doing a Yoda impression out of nowhere. So I'm gonna quit. Well, I'm ahead. James Grimm Desborough, Postmortem Studios, tabletop role playing company. Check out Grimm's games at post-mort.com. Post-mort.com. Grim, thanks so much for coming on It's Not Therapy and sharing some pretty intimate thoughts about friendship.
Anytime.
And I just realized I have not given out the contact information this whole show. Liana at nottherapyshow.com. That's my email, but the website is Not Therapy Show. You can fill out the contact form while you're there. Join our mailing list or at Not Therapy Show on social medias. When we come back, we're going to go back to that idea that being responsible for your own emotional needs does not mean protecting the world from your emotional needs on this episode of Men and Reciprocity in Friendships on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we have less than 4 minutes left in this show. I always love talking to Grimm, so I always go long. But like I said before the break, we're going to circle back to that thing I said. Being responsible for your emotional needs does not mean protecting the world from your emotional needs. And this was something that, you know, the unspoken, unsaid, not wanting to get into it dance that men do with each other gets in the way of. Because meeting your own emotional needs means reaching out and being just a little bit vulnerable, before you're facing an internal collapse. When you don't do that, the only time you communicate your needs is when things come out at a crisis point. Often a physical health crisis. But again, enough about me. I've done that 3 times in my life. I had to get physically sick to realize that things needed to change. Now, this is hard. Even being a little bit vulnerable is hard because there's so much shame associated with expressing our emotional needs, and we do not have time to get into that now. Instead, I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions about how to broach the topic. One, if your friend seems withdrawn or not himself, are you okay? Really, it's okay not to be, is enough. And they may not want to talk about it. He may not want to talk about it. Just say, not really, but I don't want to talk about it. Let him set that boundary. And then say, is there anything I can do? He'll probably say no. And then say, is there anything I cannot do? Which will probably make him laugh. And then, instead of pushing, just say, well, if there's anything I can do, I want to do it because I'm glad you're in my life. My life is better with you than without you. And even that little bit of, I like you in my life can be the difference. That is a bit of reciprocity. That is feeding the human need to not want to be merely tolerated, but wanted. And if you are looking to reach out and don't know how, you don't want to be a burden, you can just say, look, I need some FaceTime. I need some social time, or I need some talk time. When's a good time? The big thing is it doesn't have to be immediate. Asking to fit someone into their schedule means you're not a burden. They'll make time for you when you have time, right? All the more reason to not let it get to the point where you're at a crisis. You can wait a couple days, a week, even a couple weeks. I know my schedule's been nuts. Sometimes it's a month till I can see somebody. But we make it happen eventually. And that's the most important thing. I think when someone is trying to make time, that matters more than exactly when it happens. The other thing I find useful is having standing things. And you book the next time when you wrap on the current one. I find that much easier to fit in schedule with busy schedules. Otherwise, time just dilates, right? Like it's wimey wibbly wobbly, to quote Doctor Who. That's more of a paraphrase. Anyway, I am out of time. Liana, Not Therapy Show. You know how it is, Not Therapy Show. Everywhere, internet, socials, all that stuff. You're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. See you next time.